Thine is a task of blood. Discharge thy task with mercy. Let thy victim feel no pain. Let sudden blow bring death, such death thyself would ask for. That is the Slaughterman's Creed. I remember hearing those words for the first time. I remember exactly where I was. And I understand the weight of those words. People ask me how many animals I think I've processed. I don't know. A few years ago, I did rough math to figure it out, and it was, at that time, around 60,000. In this episode, we're only going to talk about knocking beef, sheep, and pigs using a captive bolt and electric stunning on pigs. In the future, we may cover electric stunning on sheep and cattle, as well as gassing.
Good cutting enhances the quality of good meat. In his way, the meat cutter is an artist. Poor cutting results in an inferior piece of meat, regardless of quality.
So it sounds like we're going to be talking about knocking in this episode. And if you don't know what knocking is, that is pretty much the industry term to rendering the animal insensible. And it comes from back in the 1920s and 30s when they didn't use a captive bolt. They used a sledgehammer, and they would literally knock the animal on the head.
Which is still how they do it pretty widely in a lot of Southeast Asia, I believe.
To do it to beef seems like it would be difficult because their heads are very hard. So I know a lot of people use essentially a pole axe, which is a sledgehammer with that goes to a point at the end, like a mini pick. Yeah. That's not mostly what we're going to discuss. We're going to discuss common methods.
There's a whole wide margin for error there.
Yeah, and I think back then they weren't too concerned with error, more for people's safety. That if you didn't render the animal insensible, that it would, could get up and hurt the workers.
Sure, I mean we've definitely killed a couple bulls that could tear down a house, I think, with a miss knock.
Yeah, and I know now that the USDA's job doesn't concern itself with the plant employees. It concerns itself with animal welfare. Some things that the USDA requires before stunning is that the animals need to have access to water, access to food over if they're being held longer than 24 hours, and they need to have dry bedding to lay down and enough room with other animals to move about freely. And then the knock box itself, which is the area where the animal goes to meet the knocker, which is the individual that is going to essentially start the processing of that animal, needs to be dry, have good footing, so it's not slick. And a lot of places on beef will use a head restraint. We've worked at places that have had headlocks, and I love headlocks.
Oh yeah, they're the best.
And then on beef, you do a captive bolt or a 22 mag, or a larger caliber. But the thing is that you want to make sure that you get through the skull to render the animal insensible.
You want to leave that bullet in the skull, though.
Yeah, you don't want something too powerful that it ends up going into the shoulder. They have different charges for captive bolt, and the captive bolt is a mechanical handheld pistol like And sometimes it's not pistol. You could hold it like a cylinder, and you put a charge in there, and it's a blank, and it shoots a rod that is surrounded by bushings to retract it. Even though the 9mm captive bolts that I've used have never retracted themselves, I've broken a lot of them because they end up falling with the carcass because they get stuck in the head. That's why I always recommend
the Cash Special.
Yeah,
that thing. I don't know a single person from that company, and just know that it's coming straight from experience. That thing is so reliable and so powerful.
Yeah, it
comfortable.
It is comfortable. If you've shot a conventional handheld firearm, you could fire the Cash. I'd recommend reading up on it and getting training. The Cash is going to set you back about between
2200
22 to 25, depending on the model you get, because there's an extenders, the charges, and the bushings. It could handle sheep, pigs, cattle, steers, all the way up to equine, which is horses. Equine's horse, but yeah, they make a horse caliber.
I wouldn't want to use it on like a rabbit or something, but a lamb sure does work.
Yeah, and when using like the 9mm captive bolts, I have heard people knocking lambs with those, firing through the skull and into their leg. So don't. So I'd recommend the Cash for
the
those.
lamb's leg and into the butcher's leg.
Yeah, into the person doing the stunning's leg. They're a little bit more awkward. They have a little bit more kick to them, and I would recommend them for knocking like a Highlander or something with a thicker hide on the brow and thicker bone as well. And the mark you're going for, you make a X right underneath the where the horn buds would be and the ears, and then you go up about a half an inch. And I know that description sounds weird. And it's never right between the eyes. If you shoot them right between the eyes, you're going to have a very upset animal at you.
You better hope that you've got a part-time job while you're laid off for a while, because that's not going to work.
Yeah. And you knock it, and from knock until bleed, the USDA, I believe, and if I'm wrong, I'm sure I'm going to hear it, I believe it's 60 seconds that FSIS wants the bleeding process to occur. I worked at places where they want it within 30 seconds. And what you're doing is, because the knock, don't get me wrong, you shoot an animal with a captive bolt in the brain, that animal's dead. No vet in the world could save that life. The animal's completely insensible. The lights are completely off. And what actually kills the animal is bleeding, is either a stick or cutting the jugular.
I mean, the brain's dead, but the central nervous system continues to function. Heart's beating. There's still electrical action throughout the body. They can't feel anything. They can't think. They're no longer sensible. But as you know, if they haven't been bled properly and the central nervous system's still working, there's lots of thrashing and kicking that can happen.
The person who does the knocking needs to be trained what to look for. So I'll start with beef, then lamb, then we'll talk about pigs, because pigs is a little different because you use electrocution sometimes. So after you knock and in between you bleed, the butcher needs to make sure the animal is insensible. So on beef, you touch the eye. And if the eye does not respond to that physical touch, then you're good. Mm-hmm. You want to make sure the tongue is listing, which means hanging loosely from the animal's mouth. The animal will thrash. There is nerve pulses being sent everywhere. All animals, including humans, are going to have low-level brain activity after a traumatic head trauma, which means they're going to move. Doesn't mean the animal's alive. Now, if the legs are kicking and the front and back legs are working in unison, or if the animal is trying to right itself, then you have a problem on your hands. And within 15 seconds from your knock, you need to do a corrective action. And that's why the USDA requires a backup. What are you going to do when this goes wrong? And statistically, in the lifespan of a plant, it will go wrong. Keep in mind, you're already shut down at this point. The inspector is doing his job, but you're just trying not to cause any unnecessary suffering.
Sure, and this is actually written into the HACCP plan, right? Which is interesting. There's not really much in the way of hazard as far as contamination at this point in the process, but it's still, because it's overseen by the USDA, written into your HACCP plan, and a proper knock has to happen from there. So we're saying right now, you've hit it with the captive bolt in the proper spot. Mm-hmm. Make an X between the outside of the eye to the horn bud on both sides, go up a half an inch. You hit it there. You touch it on the eye, it blinks. At this point,
I would take a safety shot. Now, blinking may not be a sign of sensibility, but vocalization and combined with writing itself can be perceived. And the USDA, there is no test. They're making a judgment call to see, well, out of these 2 out of 5 things that occurred, I believe it was coming back to sensibility. And now coming back to sensibility and sensibility are completely different things. And that's where you had that window to make your corrective action. If you freeze and you mess up, then you should probably move on to a different position at the plant. I don't like knocking. It stresses me out. I could do it all day long custom, but as soon as I have some person there judging me and I freeze up, I don't think I could ever be in the adult film industry because of that. It's just it's weird. It's awkward. So
yeah, it can be awkward. I think it part of it kind of depends on your inspector. I've had one inspector who absolutely insisted on me. He'd want to get real close and just look for anything and have me touch everything multiple times, the contact points, and he made it into much more of an event than it was in some ways. You have criteria that are established so that you can reference those, and if they're satisfied, you can move along. And I've had an inspector that would kind of just wait for something to go wrong.
Yeah.
But he also really wanted to take the safety shot too, which was very exciting for him. So I think that had something to do with it. Speaking of safety shots, though, what do you suggest? What have you used for your safety shot? Do you reload your captive bolt, or do you have something else on hand?
I would either have another captive bolt on hand, but honestly, if you're using a head restraint and it's messed up to the point where the animal is not even phased, it is not going to let you get that close again. So I would use a 22 mag with a Hornet inside of it. And I would stand back a couple, take a deep breath. The animal will square you up and then take that shot.
So tell me about the Hornet.
Okay, so the Hornet is a hollow tip but coppered case, and it is fired from a 22 mag, and it will penetrate the skull and immediately flare out and scramble the brain.
So it's the full metal jacket with the hollow point.
Yes.
Sweet. Okay.
Yeah. And it is reliable. But, I didn't think, 22 could, a regular 22 can't achieve what a 22 mag in this round could do.
True.
And I've used it on long shots. I've done, shot over 30 feet and hit that sweet spot and dropped animals right there using iron sights. I don't suggest people do that unless they're very confident with a gun. And then your corrective action, if you solely use a 22 mag, is simply cycling through another bullet and shooting it again.
Sure.
Now, before that process, you need to confine the animal. And I've used knock boxes where you run it through a pen system with, a suspect pen, because you need to keep some animals separate and some animals